Welcome all. I'm joined today by Dr. Irina Ghaplanyan, a political scientist. We'll be discussing Nagorno-Karabakh, remedial secession, the POWs issue, and other related topics. So Irina, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Nagorno-Karabakh at the moment is facing what many analysts have coined a creeping ethnic cleansing. Azerbaijani forces recently crossed the line of contact, taking over heights on Mount Karagluch. In Khramort, loudspeaker systems were even brought in, telling the villagers to leave or be forced to do so. The gas supply as well to Nagorno-Karabakh was cut twice this winter when the residents were facing sub-zero temperatures at night. So what do you think the strategy of the Aliyev regime is? Do you agree that creeping ethnic cleansing is the policy of the Azerbaijani government?
Yes, I would certainly agree with that, and I would go further and say that it's not simply a policy. I think it's a grand strategy for Azerbaijan right now, and I think what we have seen so far is a modus operandi that's not necessarily in a hurry, in the sense that there have been opinions that Azerbaijan wants to use the current ongoing war in Ukraine as a distraction, which it did to a certain extent. But given the circumstances and the signature of Aliyev's regime on what's you've so poignantly dubbed as creeping ethnic cleansing, I think they're in no hurry. I think at this point they realize that for them, taking over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh is a long-term goal, because a full ethnic cleansing with 100,000 plus Armenians living on their indigenous lands would be too risky for Baku to undertake. Although, given that there was ample intelligence and information from Western countries as well as Russia, confirming that it was Azerbaijan who started the war, confirming multiple cases of war crimes, and also confirming the use of mercenaries during the war, Azerbaijan did get away with murder, pretty much. By definition of international law, Aliyev is a war criminal, yet he walks freely into Brussels and goes for negotiations. So that's something to think about largely. But to come back to your question, I would certainly say that absolutely there is a strategy for grand strategy for ethnic cleansing and creeping ethnic cleansing, and they don't want to do it in one go. It would be too risky for them. So they're gradually chipping away the already shrunk population of Artsakh by this terrorizing, by psychological terror, by what I call the climate terror. I think it was very well calculated when the temperatures would be sub-zero. I mean, it was very unprecedented to have that amount of snowfall and those sub-zero temperatures we saw in March. And I think it was very well planned they had the forecast of the weather and they wanted to hurt as much as possible the population of Artsakh. And they continue to do that. And this is something that I believe they will not stop. They will continue doing that.
And Armenia has opened cases against Azerbaijan in international courts, like the International Court of Justice, and the courts did rule for the most part in Armenia's favor. At the same time, many believe that these international courts can only really serve justice when a regime has fallen. If it's Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, Charles Taylor in Liberia. Aliyev, however, remains firmly in power. Taking note of that, do you think that these cases are, however, still important and are something that the Armenian side should pursue?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the biggest failures of Armenian diplomacy and Armenia's foreign policy establishment for the last 30 years was non-engagement in and non-use of international legal instrumentary available to the country. From 1990s, when we just ended the first war and signed the ceasefire, already we had ample evidence and base to start the processes of claiming sovereignty for Artsakh back in the 90s. The government didn't use them and continues to be very reluctant and lackluster in using this very important instrumentary. And now there's a strong argument indeed that the extent to which international law can go is limited because enforcement mechanisms are limited. Yes, but unless you engage into the use of international legal instrumentary, you do not build the political capital that otherwise you could build through these processes. And now you already said that indeed the International Court of Justice made a court order. It's not a court verdict. In fact, these proceedings last years and can be very draining on parties to the case. But since Armenia brought the claim to the International Court of Justice with ample evidence, and we have already seen a court order that was part of the preliminary measures to which the court had to respond. And you're absolutely right. For the large part, it was very pro-Armenian. One of the strongest points was preservation and non-damage to the cultural heritage, something through which the court order also concluded that Azerbaijan didn't engage in deliberate destruction of Armenian cultural heritage. So to reiterate, I think these instruments are critically important, and Armenia should have engaged years ago, and we had ample evidence already, as I said, in the 90s, but also and particularly after the gruesome killing of Armenian soldier in Hungary by Azerbaijani soldier in the framework of NATO event, and the subsequent glorification of the mentioned individual as a hero. So glorification on a state level of someone who committed a morbid crime is a clear evidence that there's a state-sponsored racial discriminatory Armenophobic policy, something that is written within the Convention on Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, which Armenia used as instrumentary to go to the World Court last year and started the proceedings.
Mm-hmm. And you were a supporter of the 2018 Armenian Velvet Revolution, and in that period between 2018 to 2020, looking back in hindsight, do you think that there were any mistakes made by the Armenian side that possibly led to military defeat in the Second Karabakh War?
Absolutely. I think most of the failures in the mentioned time frame between 2018 and 2020 had to do with inaction. I think there was substantive inaction on reforming the military. Military reform was voiced, was agreed upon, was agreed that it's necessary, but it was way too slow. It focused on not important issues, particularly because the government already knew that Azerbaijan is actively preparing for war. So I think one of the very important things that we have to keep in mind that there was ample intelligence and knowledge on the part of the government that the war essentially was imminent at the time, and it didn't use all of the potential instrumentary it had to reform the military, to prepare the military for the war, to purchase the necessary weaponry, to understand the gaps in our defense systems, to prepare the population for the war. And most importantly, or equally importantly, to prepare its foreign policy establishment for the war, which was, I guess, one of the biggest gaps, not only in the time that led to the war, but also afterwards as well. I think to date, our foreign policy establishment, namely the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, still has inherent gaps, massive institutional drawbacks, massive institutional gaps, and this is something that should have been addressed very early on by this administration. It has not been the case in the period leading up to the war, and I still don't see that happening.
Mm. And in terms of what's going on at the moment, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev just met in Brussels, and the Azerbaijani government has announced that it has instructed its foreign ministry to prepare for a peace treaty. The Armenian side too has said that it is in favor of a future peace agreement with Azerbaijan. When you hear talk of a future peace treaty, what do you think?
I'm worried because I think that first and foremost, we have to understand and provide a clear definition what peace means for us. What we saw happen in Brussels 2 days ago was largely a testament to the fact that we do not have a clear understanding or definition of what peace for Armenians means. Because the statements that were released by Prime Minister Pashinyan or by Michel were certainly a testament that Armenia was again conciliatory in the process, and I explain why. First of all, if we're talking about peace, we need to understand how Artsakh plays into the whole scenario and understanding. If we're talking about delimitation and demarcation and only Azerbaijani and Armenian relations and not discussing Artsakh, that by itself and by definition is problematic, because Artsakh is inhabited by Armenians, and Armenia for decades has been a guarantor of security of Armenians living in Artsakh. So the whole discussion and the narrative that came out of that meeting is problematic to me, because it doesn't speak of the status of Artsakh, it doesn't speak of the security of Artsakh, it doesn't speak of the role of the OSCE Minsk group moving forward, because the policy of Aliyev's regime was to cancel out the role of the OSCE Minsk group, and it went as far as canceling out the existence of Nagorno-Karabakh. In most recent speeches of Aliyev, he basically said Nagorno-Karabakh does not exist. Every day we see this historical revisionism and revisionism of political narrative, and they're gradually, through this discourse, chipping away not only the rights of the people of Artsakh to sovereignty, but the mere existence of Artsakh. So I think before we engage into this discussion whether the 5-point proposal by Baku was acceptable to Armenia or not, we need to really understand for ourselves, how do we define peace?
And, in the November 9th, 2020 agreement, for example, there was a clause calling for the immediate release of all POWs. But the last return of POWs, I believe, happened in February, where Armenian POWs were returned from Baku jails. President of the European Council, Charles Michel, in his statement, again called for the release of detainees. But progress has been so grueling on this issue. How do you think the POWs issue plays into Azerbaijan's strategy?
I think it was a major tactical mistake on the part of Azerbaijan, because as we saw immediately after the war, and now almost 18 months after that, international community actively condemned Azerbaijan's position. It became immediately clear to international community and other stakeholders, mainly the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairing countries, that this was just a bargaining chip for Azerbaijan, and they were using human beings to extort diplomatic concessions on the part of Armenia, diplomatic political concessions on the part of Armenia. So I think very early on it became clear that it was a tactical mistake on the part of Azerbaijan. But on the other hand, it gave us more instrumentary to showcase that Azerbaijani policy is that of continuous dehumanization of Armenian lives. And I think our respective institutions within the government did an immense job by constantly taking cases, particularly to the European Court of Human Rights, showcasing how Azerbaijan was mistreating the POWs and how it was, by extension, using them as political bargaining chips, diplomatic bargaining chips, etc. And there's obviously a lot of leaked information, a lot of video material that reinforces that position of Baku. I'm referring to the infamous video of Aliyev and Erdogan's exchange about how we're going to piece by piece give back those POWs. So I think in a summary, absolutely, it was a tactical mistake on the part of Azerbaijan, and I hope they will pay dearly for what they have done, and it continues to be an issue for them, but they continue to keep our men and women in custody for, again, political and diplomatic bargaining.
And one of the most complex issues when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh is the issue of status. But since the 2020 war, it is almost difficult to envisage what the status of Nagorno-Karabakh will be one day. One of the more popular resolutions is called remedial secession. I'm wondering what you think about remedial secession, and also, do you think that the 2020 war has made it impossible to one day envisage remedial secession for Nagorno-Karabakh?
Well, first of all, I think we need to forget the concept of remedial secession and focus specifically on remedial sovereignty, and I'll explain why. First of all, Artsakh was never part of anything to cede from anything to begin with. Artsakh had full rights to sovereignty and had proven to the international community over the past 30 years that it is earning and it has earned a so-called phased sovereignty, whereby it has built government, it has built institutions, it has done so on democratic principles, it has the land, the population, an election system in place. And Artsakh was never part of anything to cede. It left the Soviet Union just like all of the 15 republics, according to the same principles and mechanisms, and Armenians living on that land had full title to that territory. So I believe that our foreign policy establishment made some dramatic and fateful, I think, mistakes early on in the 90s and then consecutively in 2000s by framing the whole status issue between two international law concepts, one territorial integrity and the other one the sovereignty, which was not right, because by defining the conflict in these two principles, we by default were agreeing to the fact that Artsakh was to cede from what was Azerbaijan at the time, which is not the case. The case is Artsakh had full rights under the respective constitutions within the Soviet Union to cede, which it did earlier before Azerbaijan did. So we need to continue framing the issue of the status of Artsakh within the concept of remedial sovereignty. Now, the concept of remedial sovereignty is comprised of a number of important principles and phases, stages that we need to engage. Well, first and foremost, and that is extremely currently needed and timely and alarming, is the principle of responsibility to protect. It's not only a principle and concept within the international law, but it's also institutionalized on the level of the United Nations. The UN Secretary General, within its structure, has a so-called Institute of Advisors or special UN special commissioners on genocide prevention, and the second one is on responsibility to protect. And we need to employ those mechanisms, those principles, and those institutions to alarm the international community that it is the case where the burden of responsibility to protect the people of Artsakh lies on the international community, namely on the UN institutions. We need to build awareness about what's happening in Artsakh. And based on that, we need to showcase to the world that these people have earned phased sovereignty and start the process of building the case for remedial sovereignty, not remedial secession.
And finally, looking onto the future, there is a great sense of angst right now in Armenia, and this is coupled with trauma after facing a very bloody war. I'm wondering what you think is the best scenario going into the future and how Armenia and Armenians can work towards that.
That's a difficult question. I think that I absolutely concur with you that angst continues to exist, and this largely stems from the external agency, from Azerbaijan not stopping its bellicose narrative. Not only does it engage in this creeping ethnic cleansing in Artsakh, it continues to articulate narrative that is absolutely hostile. Speaking of, not only Artsakh being part of historic Azerbaijan, which is absolute nonsense and invention of institutionalized historical revisionism of that country, but also it has now territorial claims to Armenia proper and continues to voice that on the highest political levels. So first and foremost, I think our respective institutions, government institutions and politicians have to start articulating a stronger narrative that building peace, a long-term peace, not a patched up, whatever we can define it, But a long-term peace requires, first and foremost, immediate seizure of this type of narrative coming from Azerbaijan. And this is a very honest and just demand to the international community to keep that pressure. Because the more Azerbaijan continues its hostile narrative, the more it continues to justify aggression against Armenians domestically, which has become part of national identity of Azerbaijan. So I think our administration, our politicians and diplomats have to be a lot more ambitious and a lot bolder, despite, and I fully understand objectively the current situation in Artsakh, the security architecture, but this is something that needs to be voiced clearly, that we do not stand for this type of narrative coming from Baku, and we can agree only to peace terms once this type of narrative stops. And we're also in no rush. This is something that Azerbaijan wanted to impose immediately after the war in 2020, but it's something that we need to tread very, very carefully and ensure that our voices are heard very clearly. The plea of Artsakh Armenians for remedial sovereignty is heard very clearly, and continue to realize that we remain the most important and the most objective lifeline for our Armenians of Artsakh to bring their grievances to the international community, whether that's through the Institute of Responsibility to Protect and Face Sovereignty. We need to continue doing this work.
Okay, well, Dr. Kaplanyan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.